Good evening. On behalf of the Faculty of Public Administration, we welcome you to today's teleconferencing session on public policy. In this session, as well as in the consecutive session, we will be discussing on various facets and aspects of public policy. This is in continuation with the earlier EduSat session we had in the month of February or March, if I am not wrong, where we had discussed about the policy cycle, the various stages of policy cycle, and we have dealt in detail about the policy formulation aspect only. And today's session we'll carry on further with the entire policy making cycle, where we just briefly discuss about formulation and a little more discuss a detailed discussion about implementation and the monitoring and evaluation aspect of the policy making cycle or policy making process. I have with me here Professor E. Vayanandan, and he will be basically initiating the discussion on the policy process or policy making process or the policy cycle, and he will be dealing with the entire remaining stages of the policy making cycle. This will be followed by a discussion on the importance of policy sciences and how policy sciences plays a very crucial and significant role in the entire stages of policy making. And finally, in the consecutive session following this, we will be taking up the intergovernmental relations vis-a-vis policy making. So just now to begin with, I request Professor Vayanandan to start along with that formulation of, after the formulation of the public policy from the implementation side.
Thank you, Dolly. I think she has rightly said that last time we tried to discuss about the what is policy and what is public policy. Then we also tried to discuss various models of public policy and importance of public policy. Today, as rightly mentioned by her, that we will be taking the policy cycle or process followed by the sub-discipline of policy sciences, and then we'll continue with the intergovernmental relationship and also the role of the Prime Minister and Cabinet Secretariat in policy making. So we all know that as a student of public administration, we all know that initially public administration was involved in policy formulation, policy implementation. The policy formulation was the domain of the politics, that is political executives. But later we also realized that because the political executives do not have that much of technical or the knowledge relating to the policy, I think we all know that the permanent executive plays a very important role in policy formulation. In taking it into consideration, I think even earlier also we have seen that Woodrow Wilson tried to have a dichotomy, saying that we are more involved in policy implementation rather than policy formulation. So later we also that we define public administration not only implementation but also plays an important role in policy formulation. So what is this policy that we already discussed in our earlier session? But before we try to understand how this policy is formulated and implemented, we have to know the process, how it takes place. So in the process, I think if we can quote the various scholars who have tried to identify whether the stages or cycle or process, first we come across the Herbert Simon in his famous book Administrative Behavior in 1947. He tries to mention 3 stages in what you call the decision making. One way we relate it to policy formulation. So he says that in this there are 3 stages. When you arriving at a decision, you have 3 stages. That is formulation. That is, one is what we understand is the first stage is the intelligence stage, where he tried to mention what is the problem, why we have to have what are the issues to be taken up, what for, what is the problem. We have to identify the problem. And next, to address that problem, I think we have to have various alternatives. That is what is called design activity. So what are the alternatives to respond or to see how this problem can be resolved? And ultimately he says the choice activity, where you have to select that alternative which you feel that it is more appropriate to deal with that problem. So this is what he tried to mention, the process or a cycle what we understand. Then we have number of other scholars like Harold Leswell, who has said there are 7 stages. He says he tried to identify there are 7 stages or process or a cycle which constitutes 7 stages. What he says: intelligence, promotion, prescription, what you call application, termination, and appraisal. Then there are other also who try to talk about, some other scholars identified, some other scholar identified 9 important stages, like in the deciding to decide, deciding how to decide, issue definition, forecasting, setting objectives and priorities, option analysis, policy implementation, monitoring, control, evaluation and review, and policy maintenance, succession and termination. So if you try to look at all these things, that is, there is something which is called a problem which has to be identified first, and how we can resolve this problem, and in that you have to have various alternatives, and ultimately you have to choose one. And this is where, and in the process, not only choosing one, you have to have various stages to implement that. So that is what we try to look into, the various scholars trying to identify the stages. So the first stage, as rightly been pointed out by various scholars, is that identifying the underlying problem. So you have rightly seen earlier, the public administration role was to enforcement of public law. So law is something where you enforce to have an orderly behavior or to maintain some sort of order, status quo. But when you say a problem, I think problem means there is some sort of a problem in this society which you have to resolve. So earlier it is only, not only law, but the larger part of law is a policy. And from policy emanates various programs, schemes, projects, and various other things. So when you trying to look at the problem, so naturally once that problem is being ascertained, what problem you have to address, because again, if you try to take the society state into context, then the problems emanate from the environment, that is the society. So as a state, it is your responsibility to address those problems. So that problems, how you will address? By deciding them, to how to resolve them through policy. So then first time is to underline the problem. Then how this problem can be resolved. So you have to have various alternatives. The second stage is determining the alternatives for that, resolving the problem. So it's not that only identifying the alternatives, you have to also forecast each and every alternative and evaluate that each and every alternative. So that what will be the what we understand, what is, suppose if you try to take this alternative, whether it can resolve that problem. So what is you have to try to forecast and also try to evaluate. This is the second stage. And the third stage is after the second stage, after evaluating, forecasting and evaluating, you will choose that what you call the alternative which you feel that it will properly address the resolving the problem. So that is what is the first phase of policy formulation. So rightly said by what you call the Herbert Simon. He says, what is decision? It is nothing but reducing the alternates to one. So if there is no need for best option. So that way you have that best option is nothing but how best you can address that in optimally you try to resolve the problem. So this is the first what you call the process of policy formulation. Then the other very crucial and important is policy implementation. So once you identify the problem and try to have various alternatives, then decide the one best alternative which try to address optimally, then you come to the implementation. Then when you whatever may be the formulation, without putting what you call putting in action, that is implementation, I think whatever the objectives you have in the formulation cannot be realized.
They remain as statements.
Yeah, statements. So that is what in India every time we feel that we have good policies, we have good schemes, we have good programs, but when it comes to action, they are not been really put in, they are not been realized. So that way they have to put in effective use, and they should reach those people, or not only people, but it also should realize the objectives for which the policy have been formulated. So the implementation is one of the major aspect of the policy cycle. So yes, in implementation also, if you try to understand, there are number of problems that we will not, that will have a whole session to take it, but briefly I am saying that yes, there are number of, because not only while implementing you have to have the organizational or the institutions created for implementing those. Not only that, you have to have people with the specialized skills. Not only that, they should be provided with some sort of an autonomy, and apart from that there should not be interference. There are a number of things which comes up, which I said that it is, I think this session will not be sufficient. So what briefly I am saying is, another important is the policy implementation. So the whatever may be the policies, which I think once they have been formulated, you put into action, that is nothing but implementation. So while implementing also, you have to try to other stages monitoring. So what do you mean by monitoring? That you try to see that whether these things are being going in a right direction. So you try to understand, you have a planning commission tries to do mid-term appraisal. What do you mean by mid-term? To find out that whether the things are going in a right direction or not. So the monitoring is nothing but one way of management and control, to see that the things goes in a right direction, and that way try to look it at the field level. If there are any corrections, it will try to rectify it. The other important what we understand after monitoring is we have to look at the policy outcomes. What is the policy outcomes? So here the policy outcomes are not policy outputs. When you say policy outcomes, it is nothing but the whatever the objectives of the policy are being realized or not. So it is not that simply building houses. It is not it may be the objectives of building houses to the poor, but the building houses, when you say outcomes, it should be properly built. If, you build a house with leakages, with not having proper doors, not having proper other things. So the outcomes should be, what we understand is, it's simply not building. It has to be built in a manner that people can live in that. So that is what is called the policy outcomes. And ultimately, we come to the last stage of what we call the cycle. It is called policy evaluation. So we try to relate the objectives, whether those objectives have been really realized or not. So in the process of evaluation, we will try to say that whether these objectives are really, are meeting the needs and demands and the problems of the society where it has come up, or is there, if it is satisfied through evaluation, naturally we will continue the same policies for further, or if there is some sort of limitations or some sort of problems or feedback, we will try to readjust and try to come out with some sort of adjustments and improvement in the policy formulation. So this is what is the basic cycle we come across the policy process. So this is this is the way the policies are formulated, implemented and monitored. Then we will also try to see the policy outcomes. Then ultimately we will evaluate and try to see that how this policy is really effective or reaching the objectives for which we have been formulated. So this is what, and so policies are not made just like that, because policy needs to understand the various dimensions of the society, because policies are nothing but the outcomes or the what we understand, the inputs which we get from the society. So earlier there was, it was as a part of political science, but later it became a sub-discipline, which I think Dr. Dolly Matthews will try to provide what exactly is this policy sciences.
Thank you, Professor Vayunandan. I'll just take it from where Professor Vayunandan has left. He has explained to all of us about, very lucidly he has explained to us the all processes in the policy making, from the formulation, from the conception to the design to the formulation to the implementation to the monitoring to evaluation, feedback, re-examining, reviewing and modifying the policy. So this entire cycle has one important and crucial component that underlies all these phases, all these various stages of the entire policy making process. What is that? That is known as policy science. as we see it in these two words, policy, science, there is one special word attached to policy, and that is science. Now, when we hear the term or the word science, what comes to our mind? What basically reflects is that what we, in fact, once we hear the word science, it means accuracy, it means some kind of reliability, relevance, precision. There may be more of rationality, there may be more of logical positivism in it, or there may be more experimentation, universality, there may be more prediction. So whenever we come across something which is based on science, what ultimately comes to our mind is that it is reliable, it is the truth. It is what we can understand universally. It can be happening in the same manner everywhere in the world. So when we say it is policy, science, we attach all the elements of science, of precision, of accuracy, of relevance, of universality, of prediction, of calculation of data, of figures, whatever facts we have to policy. And there is where we term it as not only public policy, but we term it as a subdiscipline of attaching the elements of science to the very process, to all the processes of policy making. Rather, it is known as a systematic and scientific study of policy making. The entire policy making process, the cycle which Professor Vayanandan has explained, is based on a systematic and scientific study. If we don't have systematic and scientific study, then how do we in fact feel our policy will be effective? It has to be based on the realities that is existing on ground. How many people are poor in our country? What is the number of the people who are below the poverty line? What is the health of our women? What is the health of our children? What is the education level for our people in the rural areas? All such facts and figures have to be there. They have to be properly analyzed. They have to be subjected to all kinds of mathematical calculations, computer calculations and all. And there is where we will arrive at some kind of a conclusion, where we can deduce on the basis of these analysis some kind of conclusion on the basis of which that will provide an effective ground for making future policies. So policy doesn't come or it doesn't drop from the sky. It has to undergo before being conceived or before being designed. This process of policy science has to be there. And need to study the realities and come up with various aspects that will help us in formulating an effective public policy. As I said, the most important fact of policy science is it is having a scientific rationality behind it. So when I say scientific rationality, as I said, it has to be based on thorough analysis and calculation. And one of the most important proponents in this area of policy science is Harold Lasswell. His pioneering work, when he gave his first work, was the policy orientation. This was the work, the policy orientation, and it came up in 1951. And this is considered to be the first among systematic effort in building a new field of inquiry into policy making. Rather, this work of Harold Lasswell, the policy orientation, is considered to be a landmark for the reason that it helps the public policy or policy science go beyond scientific rationality. Everything can't be calculated so precisely as science, because once we are dealing with the social problems, science cannot be totally fulfilled in all its principles vis-a-vis the society. The societal problems are too many, they are very complex in nature and keep on changing, varies from individual to individual. It is not in a stable environment like you are experimenting in a lab. You can't put human behavior in a lab. You can't put human needs and necessities and aspirations, desires, everything in a very controlled environment, and there you are experimenting with the human need. No. What I need today may not be the thing which I need tomorrow, and because of my changing environment, because of my needs and all, things go changing. And this policy, which is being made by our politicians as well as by our administrators, implemented by our executors, have to take cognizance of these complexities and these changing nature of human needs, human problems, various issues affecting the development of human beings or people in our society. It can't be thoroughly scientific. It can't be the only truth. It can't be predicted like what is happening in European countries or in the developed world will happen in our country as well. There may be variations among the developing countries also. So it has to be contextual, it has to be problem oriented and very much focused to the realities of the society. And therefore, a new definition of policy science emerged. Earlier, actually policy science was there since times. Everybody used to apply, Kautilya used to apply science to the making of policies, even if it was the times of rulers or kings. But the present orientation of policy science, where it has to address to the social realities, comes from somewhere between the 20th century, where it leaves the earlier pattern of just being very scientific, just being very accurate, which it cannot be in any case when you are dealing with a policy vis-a-vis the society. So there is where this transition came, and that was brought about by the Harold Lasswell's work of the public orientation, and there is where he in fact considers that the policy science goes beyond mere scientific rationality and addresses to a very broader theory of reason into society. Reason into society. What is the reason? What is the problem? Why? What are the causes of that problem? Let the policy address that. And hence emancipation will take place. So it goes beyond, the work goes beyond the scientific reality or accuracy, prediction, truthfulness, what we associate with science. And it takes into consideration the social realities, and there is a broader range. It doesn't concise itself to the society, to the science, but into the various aspects, into various disciplines, and becomes very inclusive, not just limited to science. Harold Lasswell in fact considers there are certain approaches to understand policy sciences, because policy sciences is a discipline that has emerged from the collective efforts from times and is able to produce and apply socially relevant knowledge, which was not earlier thought of. So he considers there are 3 or 4 approaches that will help us explain as how policy science has developed and evolved from times. And he considers the first and the most important of a component of policy science is that it is multidisciplinary in perspective. It is not just science. Neither it is totally applied social science, neither it is totally applied economics, neither it is totally applied what we can say psychological science, or it is not totally management. It is all inclusive. It is not unidisciplinary. It is multidisciplinary. And there is where Jeskel Rohr, one of the most important policy scientists, have said that policy science need to integrate knowledge from a variety of branches of knowledge. So it is not just limited to knowledge handpicked from science or from only social science or from, I say, management. No, it has to take from a variety of branches of knowledge. It has to be conceived as a knowledge from a variety, handpicked from variety of branches of knowledge and formed into a supra-discipline, a major discipline that will address to the problems of the society and that will help making public policy effective. Then he says the second most important thing, a very important component of policy science apart from being multidisciplinary, is that it takes into consideration the context. What context? What is being implemented or formulated or conceived in developed world or in other countries cannot be local specific for us. It may not fit into our context, into our region specific needs, into our own local needs. A policy has to take this into consideration. It has to work as per the constraints of the region, of the area in which it is being applied. I can't in fact have some kind of policy of America being implemented in Delhi. I have to, the policy makers have to take into cognizance the region specific needs, the infrastructure what we have or resources we have. The mindset of the people, the community, everything may be different as compared to the other countries. So the policy science have to address to this factor, and this is a very important component of policy science, that it has to be context based. Again, problem oriented. If it has to be context based, it definitely needs to address to the problems related to that region or to that area or to that local area or any area where it is being applied or it is being formulated for. And here and where policy science comes up with two important approaches of policy analysis. Why policy analysis? Why policy science gives focus on policy analysis? Rather, policy analysis is one of the most important component of policy sciences because it helps policy sciences to know the problems, to know the kind of context according to which the policies have to be made. And the two approaches in policy analysis which the policy science addresses is analysis of policy and the other is analysis for policy. When it comes to analysis of policy, it basically policy analysis becomes an academic activity, because here is where it tries to the academic activity in the sense it helps us in advancing our understanding of policy. What is the theory of policy? What is policy? What are meta policies? What are mega policies? Etc. etc. So that is basically academic or theoretical knowledge vis-a-vis policy. The other part, analysis for policy. What is analysis for policy? That is, it is considered to be an applied activity where we will try to come out with policy, the problems it is going to address and the solutions it's going to give it in the hands of the people. So one is applied, the other one is academic in nature. And these two approaches, that is analysis of policy and analysis for policy, are integrated in policy science. The two are there in policy science. It can't be just academic activity or it can't be just applied activity. The two have to be, the twin approaches have to be there in policy sciences. And here is where the policy science uses policy analysis. How does it do policy analysis? It applies various techniques. How it is analyzing the policy, how it is analyzing the people's problem? By applying techniques like operational research, like linear programming, cost-benefit analysis, or even, there are management information systems, or there may be PPBS, that is the program planning budgeting system. All these techniques can be used by policy science to do a wonderful and effective policy analysis, and on the basis of which it can define the public policy problems and the solutions in a very rational way, and also can subject the policy problems and the solutions to very substantive empirical analysis. So there is where policy science focuses on policy analysis, which becomes very important in understanding and analyzing the problems of people, coming out with policies that may come out as solutions to the problems of the people, and also furthering the knowledge of policies by making it also an academic activity in advancing understanding of the policy. Here and where we can mention about Edward Quates. He gives 5 basic elements of policy analysis, which Professor Vayunandan has also highlighted to a greater extent. The 5 elements of policy analysis which Edward Quates, in his beautiful work of analysis for public decisions, which he came out in 1975, he underlines or pinpoints 5 key elements in policy analysis, and that is, number 1 is identification of objectives. A policy analysis begins with identification of objectives, and after the identification of objectives takes place, you have to specify the alternatives. Then you have to recommend the appropriate or the one best alternative that will help in making your policy. Then you will have to monitor the policy outcomes and evaluate the policy performance. These 5 elements constitute policy analysis, which in part and parcel are of policy science. Another aspect apart from policy analysis is policy process, because here and where the jump is there, the shift is there from scientific rationality to a broader theory of inquiry or broader theory of reasoning into the societal problems, into the societal realities. So the transition is there, the shift is there from being simple theory of scientific rationality or science or rational ideals to that of democracy and pluralistic norms. After the, it is what is being, earlier it was considered that policy process has come as a as a critique of policy analysis. Right now what has come up, most of the policy scientists are of the view that both policy analysis as well as policy process, both are in fact necessary in policy science. So they have to be integrated, and policy science have to take policy analysis and policy process to understand the context as well as the problems of that context, so that accordingly the policy is made. One more important component, apart from being multidisciplinary and context-based and region and problem-based, one more important component what Lasswell in fact highlights is about the normative concerns. Earlier, if we say about scientific rationality, there is no place for normative concerns. Norms, human dignity, human value, ethics, equity, justice, fairness is not there. You only talk of science. I have given you this much of amount, this of resources, you come out with this amount of output. What is your emotional value? What is your informal relation? Whether there is justice, there is equity, there is liberty, nothing of that kinds of concerns or normative values were there when we talked just about scientific rationality in policy sciences. But of late and in the present orientation, policy science takes into its ambit the normative values, the human values, concern for human dignity, realization of human capacities, which has rather become the cornerstone of policy sciences. Apart from this, he also gives importance to certain emerging trends in policy sciences. What had happened was, this all was from 1951 to 60 and 70. In the late 80s and in the beginning of 90s, there was an urgency felt on part of the policy scientists all the world over to revisit policy science once again, because it had to be made socially relevant. And so, with this revisitation, certain emerging concerns came up in the field of policy science. Rather, now it was not anymore to be a policy science. It was to be termed as policy inquiry. Inquiry into what? Inquiry into the realities of the society. Inquiry into the conditions of the farmers. Inquiry into the conditions of women. Inquiry into the conditions of the people who are disadvantaged, who have not got any privileges any time ever since our country became independent. So we have to look into these realities. So it's no more policy science. The policy science makes the transition from being a policy science based on scientific rationality to policy inquiry, to a broader theory of reasoning, to a broader theory of communication into the societal realities. And wherein he says the first and the foremost emerging concern that has come up in policy science is of adding the normative values into policy science ambit. And herein where he gives, there are 4 approaches which will help us to understand and study ethics and values in policy sciences, which earlier it was not there. And this revisitation has brought all these ethics and human concern and normative concern in policy sciences. The first and the foremost approach which help us to study ethics and values in the policy sciences is about social philosophy and political theory. They in fact give values to communitarianism, they give values to utilitarianism, that is do well and good to everybody, and also about liberty and equality in the very task of policy formation. And there is where they try to build in this ethics and value. So this approach of social philosophy and political theory tries to build in liberty, equality, utilitarianism and communitarianism into the very task, into the very job of policy formation. The second approach, again, it is a study of equity or ethics and values in policy sciences, and that is in fact known as the ethical concerns, ethical values, and ethical morality and social values. It considers that all individuals and groups who are inside and outside the public service will be forced to make judgments, ethical and moral judgments, value-based judgments on the actions of the bureaucrats. So it's not only within, but even outside, the groups and the individuals outside, falling outside the public service, will also be making these kinds of concrete ethical and value judgments on a regular basis. And if these judgments are there at regular basis, one can come to know about the accountability of the bureaucracy, whether they are corrupt, and if they are corrupt, that can be brought out by these ethical and moral and value judgments of the people outside the public service. The third approach that studies this ethics and values in policy science is the professional and administrative ethics. Rather, it impels upon the public servants to give more importance to public duties and responsibilities as compared to their own private interests. Maybe the country it keeps on going, whether I have to look into my own personal interest, but no, the upper hand has to be there of the public duties and responsibilities, the professional conduct has to be there. Administrative ethics emerges from this basic fact that public duty is the prime. You need to be professional in your conduct, in your public action, not concerned with private interest. But in India, this is rarely getting possible, where we in fact see high level of corruption. So these approaches are an emerging concern in the area of policy science. Then another thing that has come up in policy science of late, after this 1990s revisitation by policy scientists, is their very much closeness to public management. As Professor Vayanandan was saying, that policy, if it remains in paper, is just a mere statement, or it is just a paper. It has to be implemented, and to implement it, policy science has convergence with public management. A public manager not only helps in policy formulation, but his basic duty is to implement that policy. And how does he do? He does 4 important functions of planning, of controlling, of planning, organizing, directing and controlling. These 4 important functions he performs to implement a policy. And here is where the policy sciences converges with the public manager in not only formulation, but also in the very implementation of a public policy. As I said, the most important emerging concern is of policy inquiry, that not only brings in a broader theory of reasoning and communication into social reality, but also accounts for the social, political, legal, moral and ethical aspects into public policy, into policy science. So earlier it was only science, but now it is social, it is political, it is economic, it is legal, it is ethical, it is value. All these rationalities are to be there in policy science. And therefore policy science cannot be just a unitary phenomena. It cannot be just a single phenomena, or for that matter very discrete. Rather, it has to be very inclusive, touching upon social realities, addressing the fundamental problems of people, fundamental problems of man in the society. And therefore, it is not an exact science. It is a social science, and which has, like other social sciences, it has its own it has its own features. It has its own improved methods of deriving knowledge, and also evolving systems for effective public policy making. I hope the learners over there would have been benefited by this discussion on policy science, and in case if there is some opinion of yours, you can let us know also. So right now I think this time for this session is getting over, and we may not have much time. So now we would like to wind up for this session, and we will be meeting you soon after some 15 minutes for the subsequent session, and where we will further take it up with Professor Vayanandan regarding the intergovernmental relations vis-à-vis policy making. Thank you.
Thank you.